Listen closely, because something's waking up in Denver. The Broncos, once the kings of the Mile High, now fighting to be heard again. New energy, new leaders, same relentless spotlight. Doubt is loud, but so is belief. And this season, it's not about rebuilding, it's about taking everything back. It was a year of enormous consequence for the Republic. A young senator from Massachusetts had just been elected to the highest office in the land on a promise that the torch had been passed, that a new generation had arrived, ready to bear whatever burden, pay whatever price, and in that same electric atmosphere, in that same spirit of daring and beginning, a new professional football league announced itself to the world. 8 teams, 8 cities, 8 chances to prove that the grand old game was not the property of the established order alone. One of those 8 cities was Denver, Colorado. Population, just under 500,000 souls. Altitude, exactly 1 mile above sea level. And ambition, quite frankly, immeasurable. The American Football League, the AFL, was a bold proposition. It was, in many respects, the football equivalent of exploring new territory. The established National Football League looked upon this new enterprise the way any entrenched power looks upon upstarts, with a mixture of disdain and dismissal. The answer, in Denver's case, was this. They had a team, they had a stadium, they had a fan base hungry beyond all reasonable measure, and they had, God help them, the most extraordinary uniform socks in the history of organized sport. Let us speak plainly about those socks. When the Denver Broncos took the field for the first time in that inaugural AFL season, they wore vertical brown and gold stripes on their stocklings. Vertical stripes, running up the leg like the bars of a cage. But here's what those socks tell us. If we are willing to look past the horror of them, they tell us that this was a team finding itself, a team not yet certain of who it was or what it would become. And is that not, in the end, the most human of conditions? Their first starting quarterback was a man named Frank Tripucka, who had been coaxed out of retirement to take the job. The team played at Bears Stadium, later to be renamed and rebuilt and reimagined entirely. The record in that first season was 4 wins, 9 losses, and 1 tie. Not impressive. And yet they played. They suited up on those high plains, and they competed, and the city fell in love with them, not because they won. They did not win, not with any frequency in those early years. The Broncos lost more games than they won in each of their first 6 AFL seasons. They finished last in their division 3 times in that span. There were moments when the franchise seemed to hang by a thread, when the question was not whether the Broncos would contend for a championship, but whether they would exist the following autumn. But Denver held on. And why? Because a city, once it has given its heart to a team, does not easily reclaim it. Because something had taken root in those Rocky Mountain plains, something as stubborn and as permanent as the granite of the peaks that overlooked the whole enterprise. A bond had been formed between a community and its football club, and that bond, once forged, is among the most durable things in American life. The socks were eventually burned, or retired, or hidden from public view. The precise details have mercifully been lost to history. What was not lost was the franchise itself. Now, a great institution is never built in a season. This we know from history. The men who drafted the Constitution did not do so in an afternoon. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad did not lay a single mile of track without 1,000 miles of failure behind them. And the Denver Broncos, in the years that followed their uncertain founding, went through precisely the kind of long and often painful apprenticeship that precedes all genuine achievement. In 1967, a man named Lou Saban took the reins of the franchise. Under his watch, the Broncos began to develop an identity. They drafted better, they played harder. The AFL itself, meanwhile, was waging its own battle for legitimacy. And in 1970, the battle ended, not with a surrender, but with a merger. The AFL and NFL came together to form a single, unified National Football League. The Broncos, along with the other AFL franchises, were absorbed into this new order. They were assigned to the American Football Conference, in the Western Division, where they would compete against the Kansas City Chiefs, the Oakland Raiders, San Diego Chargers, and later the Seattle Seahawks. This was not a gentle neighborhood. The Chiefs had won the Super Bowl and carried themselves with the confidence of proven champions. The competition was severe, and for several years, the Broncos sat or at near the bottom of this formidable division. But something was changing. You could see it if you watched closely, in the way a team competed, in the quality of the young men joining the roster, in the growing intensity of the fan base. Mile High Stadium, was becoming one of the loudest, most difficult visiting environments in all of professional football. The people of Denver were not passive observers. They were participants. They roared and stomped and believed with a fervor that bordered on the theological. A Denver Broncos season ticket was, in this era, among the most coveted commodities in the state of Colorado. Waiting lists grew. Orange became a color of identity, not merely a football preference. At some point in the late 1960s, the Broncos shed their original brown and gold color scheme and adopted the bright, unmistakable, absolutely unapologetic orange that would define them for generations. It was not a tentative color. It was not a color that suggested ambiguity or hedging. Orange declares itself. Orange says, here we are, look at us, we are not going anywhere. In a city defined by the blaze of autumn on the aspen trees and the glow of the afternoon light on the mountain snowpack, orange was, when you considered it, the only honest choice. The years passed, coaches came and went. Broncos remained competitive, but unreached in terms of true postseason glory. In 1973, they won 7 games and missed the playoffs. In 1974, 7 wins again. In 1975, 6 wins. Patient football, grinding football. The football of a team that is not yet ready for its moment, but is quietly, surely preparing for it. In 1976, Red Miller was waiting in the wings, and the moment, the first truly transcendent moment in Denver Broncos history, was almost at hand. There are seasons in sport, as in politics, as in all of human endeavor, when everything converges. When the talent is right, the coaching in the moment presents itself with an unmistakable clarity. The 1977 Broncos were such a convergence. Red Miller took over as head coach that year, and he brought with him an energy, a belief. Something almost evangelical in its intensity. This was a man who was convinced, in the marrow of his bones, that the Denver Broncos were ready, and he set about making the rest of the football world understand it. The cornerstone of that 1977 team was its defense, the Orange Crush. The defense was built around a remarkable collection of players. Linebacker Tom Jackson, whose fire and intelligence set the tone. Lyle Alzado, a force of nature at defensive end. Lewis Wright, one of the finest corners in his generation. Collectively, they were not merely a defense, they were an identity. They were the embodiment of a city's determination to be taken seriously. The Broncos won 12 games in the regular season of 1977, 12 wins. For a franchise that had never before known sustained excellence, 12 wins felt like a coronation. The city of Denver responded with a joy that was, by all accounts, spectacular in its sincerity. Those were fans who had waited 17 years for a winning season of this magnitude, and they were not about to be quiet about it. The Broncos rolled through the playoffs. They beat Pittsburgh in the divisional round. Pittsburgh, who had won 2 of the previous 3 Super Bowls. The victory was stunning. It was, in the language of our times, a major upset. And yet, when you watched the game, the faces of the Denver players after that game, the players who had prepared and practiced and believed through all of those long seasons of near misses, it did not look like surprise. It looked like a rival. It looked like a team that had always known it would eventually reach this place, and was simply finally here. Then came the Raiders. The Oakland Raiders were Denver's great and perpetual tormentors. They were everything the Broncos aspired to be, experienced, physical, triumphant, and they arrived at Mile High Stadium for that 1977 AFC Championship with the full weight of their reputation. But on that January afternoon, the Orange Crush held. The Denver defense dismantled the Oakland offense with a ferocity that was breathtaking to witness. The Broncos won 20-17. They had done it. They had reached the Super Bowl. Denver, Colorado celebrated as perhaps it had never celebrated before. This was not merely a sporting achievement. This was a civic moment. This was the validation of 17 years of faith, of those ugly socks in those empty stadiums on the early days, of every fan who had sat in the January cold and refused to leave. This a new frontier reached. The Super Bowl was played in New Orleans. The Dallas Cowboys awaited. And here we must pause and speak the truth in full, as in any honest chronicler must. The Cowboys were better, not by the measure of heart, not by the measure of will, not by the measure of the city behind the team, but on the field. On that day in Louisiana, the Dallas defense, featuring the remarkable Doomsday 2 unit, was simply superior. The Broncos turned the ball over 4 times. They lost 27-10. It was a hard outcome for a proud city. But here's what the loss did not do. It did not break the bond. It did not diminish the love. The Denver Broncos went home to their mountains in their orange-clad faithful, and the faithful said, "We will be back. You will try again. This is not the end of the story." They were right, but they could not have imagined in 1978 just how long the next chapter would take to write, or how gloriously it would eventually be completed. It is a rare thing, genuinely rare, in sport or in any other human enterprise, when a single individual changes everything. Changes not merely the fortunes of an organization, but its essential nature, its identity, its relationship with hope itself. Such an individual arrived in Denver in the spring of 1983, and his name was John Elway. Let us understand the circumstances of his arrival, because they are instructive. Elway had been the most celebrated college quarterback in the nation at Stanford University. The Baltimore Colts held the first pick of the 1983 NFL Draft, and they selected him. And Elway, with a directness that surprised many and offended some, made it clear that he did not wish to play for Baltimore. He wished to play for a team with better prospects, better coaching, better everything. He was not shy about it. He was, in a word, demanding, and he had the talent to make his demands credible. The Colts, faced with a quarterback who refused to report, traded him to the Denver Broncos for multiple players and draft picks. The trade was, from Denver's perspective, the single most consequential transaction in the history of the franchise. From the moment John Elway pulled on the orange jersey for the first time, the Denver Broncos became a different organization. Not immediately a championship organization. The path to the summit still had mountains ahead of it, but an organization with a quarterback of such transcendent ability that failure, when it came, felt temporary, and possibility still felt permanent. Elway was, by every measure, a singular talent. He threw the ball with a velocity that made receivers wince at practice. He ran with a speed that no defensive coordinator could comfortably ignore. He possessed that rarest of athletic gifts, the ability to function at its highest level precisely when the pressure was at its most intense. He did not shrink from the moment. He expanded to meet it. In his first season, 1983, the Broncos went 9-7 and missed the playoffs. The adjustment period was real and occasionally painful. Elway, learning on the job, threw more interceptions than touchdowns. The promise was evident. The mastery was still forthcoming. By 1984, they reached the playoffs. By 1985, they won their division, season by season. Head coach Dan Reeves, a man of quiet intensity and considerable tactical intelligence, was building something around his extraordinary young quarterback. And then came January of 1987, and the single greatest individual performance in the history of the Denver Broncos franchise, possibly in the history of the American Football Conference. We call it simply the Drive. The Broncos and the Cleveland Browns met in the Cleveland Municipal Stadium on January 11, 1987, for the AFC Championship. The temperature was bitter, the crowd was fervent, the Browns were playing at home, and they were playing well, and with less than 6 minutes remaining in the game, they led by a score of 20-13. The Broncos had the ball on their own 2-yard line, followed over the next 5 minutes and 2 seconds of a game, 15 plays, 98 yards, third downs converted, incompletions absorbed, pressure endured. Each play called, each ball thrown, each yard gained was a decision made under circumstances that would have paralyzed the lesser man. Elway completed the drive with a 5-yard touchdown pass to Mark Jackson. The game was tied. Denver won in overtime. The Drive. It remains one of the most celebrated sequences in the history of professional football, not because of the championship that ultimately followed it that day, but because of what it revealed about the man executing it. It revealed a will that matched his arm, a mind that matched his legs, a heart that matched everything else. The following year, 1988, brought another AFC Championship appearance, another visit to Cleveland, and this time, the game turned on a single, heartbreaking play. Running back Ernest Biner, a Cleveland Brown, a man who had played brilliantly all day, fumbled the ball just short of the goal line with less than a minute to play. We call that one the fumble. The geography of sports history is littered with these moments, plays that define and divide, that are remembered forever by one side for joy and by the other side for grief. January 31, 1988, Denver versus the Washington Redskins. The Broncos led at halftime 10-0, and then the second half began. The Redskins scored 35 unanswered points in a single quarter, 35 points, and Denver lost 42-10. It was a historic defeat. Not historic in the way that victories are historic, but historic in the grim, statistical sense, the margin, the swiftness of the collapse, the totality of the reversal. John Elway answered reporters' questions afterward with a dignity that was, under the circumstances, remarkable. He did not make excuses. He did not deflect. He sat with the loss and bore its full weight. Following the 1989 season brought a fourth Super Bowl appearance for the Broncos in this era. San Francisco waited, led by Joe Montana, who was at that moment perhaps the finest quarterback in the NFL. The 49ers won 55-10. It remains to this day one of the most lopsided defeats in Super Bowl history. 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, 3 losses, 2 of them catastrophic in their margin. There is a test in football, as in life, that goes beyond the mere accumulation of victories. It is the test of character under repeated failure. It is a question of whether you will return to the arena having already tasted its most bitter outcomes, whether you will suit up again, practice again, believe again, when the evidence of your experience suggests that the prize may be on. The early 1990s were, for the Denver Broncos, a time of reconstruction. The teams of Elway's era first great chapter, those Super Bowl runners-up of 1987, 88, and 90, were aging. The roster required renovation. Dan Reeves departed after the 1992 season. Wade Phillips came and went. In 1994, a 5-11 season, the worst record of the Elway era, the question arose, openly and earnestly in the sports pages of the Denver Post and Rocky Mountain News, whether the window had closed, whether the great quarterback was, at 34 years of age, entering the final phase of a magnificent career that would conclude without the championship. And then came 1995, and the answer to that question arrived in the form of a compact, energetic, and devastatingly resourceful football coach named Mike Shanahan. Shanahan had served as Denver's offensive coordinator during the great Super Bowl years of the late 1980s. He knew the franchise. He knew, with the certainty that marks all truly great coaches, exactly what kind of team he intended to build. He would run the ball. He would run it with creativity, with misdirection, with the kind of zone blocking scheme that could make an ordinary running back look exceptional. He would protect his quarterback. He would build an offense that functioned as a single integrated instrument rather than a collection of individual talents. And he would win. Not at once, not without setbacks, but with the methodical, purposeful confidence of a man who has a plan and the intelligence to execute it. The 1995 season ended in the AFC Championship, where Indianapolis, led by everybody's favorite quarterback Jim Harbaugh, proved a more formidable obstacle than anticipated. A loss, a bitter loss. But the foundation was solid. The program was ascending, and in the 1996 offseason, a young running back from Georgia arrived in Denver on his 4th NFL team. A young man whose knees had been doubted, whose durability had been questioned, whose career had shuddered and started without ever truly catching fire. His name was Terrell Davis. The 1997 Denver Broncos were, in retrospect, a team of destiny. That phrase is used too casually in sports narration. Let us be specific about what it means in this case. It means that the particular combination of players, coaches, circumstances, and moment aligned in a way that made the achievement not merely possible, but on reflection almost inevitable. Though it did not feel inevitable at the time, and the outcome was not certain until the final play of the final game. Terrell Davis in the 1997 season was one of the most dominant players in professional football. He ran for 1,750 yards in the regular season. He was physical and intelligent and possessed of a competitive spirit that was, by every account, extraordinary. He was the engine of the Denver offense, and around him Mike Shanahan built one of the most efficient and punishing running attacks in NFL history. Elway, now 37 years old, was the wise and wily veteran directing the machine. He was no longer needed to be the singular heroic figure of the 1986 drive. He needed to manage the game, make the critical throws, and lead. He was at this stage of his extraordinary career perfectly suited for precisely that role. The Broncos won 12 games in the regular season. They moved through the AFC playoffs with an efficiency and conviction. The AFC Championship was against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a team that had defeated Denver in the playoffs the previous season, and the Broncos won it decisively. San Diego, California, January 25, 1998. The Denver Broncos versus the Green Bay Packers. The Packers were the defending Super Bowl champions. Brett Favre was their quarterback, young, brilliant, seemingly unstoppable. The Packers were favored, and here we arrive at one of the genuinely remarkable moments of the history of professional football. Terrell Davis rushed for 157 yards and 3 touchdowns. This despite suffering a migraine headache that temporarily blurred his vision in the second quarter and required him to briefly leave the game. He returned. Of course he returned. He ran with a ferocity and a precision that no defensive scheme the Packers presented could contain. The game went into its final moments with the Broncos ahead by 7 points. The Packers drove. They scored. They converted the extra point, 31-24. Green Bay had the ball back with time remaining, and the game's outcome was not certain. And then Elway, his team in possession, his team protecting a 7-point lead with 3 minutes remaining, executed a play that NFL films would later call one of the defining images of his career. Scrambling to escape the rush, he dove for a first down and at 37 years of age was hit by 2 Packer defenders and spun through the air like a helicopter rotating before landing, still clutching the ball. He rose from the turf, pumping his fist. Denver won, 31-24. The final whistle sounded, and across the state of Colorado, something released. Something accumulated pressure of 38 years of professional football without a championship. Some long-held breath. John Elway, helmet in hand, moved across the field through the noise and the chaos, and his face showed something beyond joy. It showed relief. It showed the particular expression of a man who has carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and has finally been permitted to set it down. Terrell Davis rushed for 2,008 yards, only the 4th player in NFL history to surpass 2,000 yards rushing in a single season. The Broncos won 14 of 16 regular season games. They returned to the Super Bowl. They played the Atlanta Falcons. They won 34-19. Back-to-back champions. And then in the spring of 1999, the architect of those championships made a decision that was entirely his own, entirely correct, and entirely bittersweet. John Elway retired. The retirement of John Elway was an ending that felt in the manner of all great endings, like something more than the conclusion of an athletic career. It felt like the closing of an era, of a specific Denver Broncos era. Yes, but also something broader. The years that followed were years of searching. The Broncos remained competitive. Mike Shanahan was too good a coach. The organization too well run for the outright mediocrity. Brian Griese quarterbacked the team with competence but not brilliance. Jake Plummer took the position and brought the franchise to the AFC Championship game in 2005, where a loss to Pittsburgh ended another promising season. But there was no Elway. There was, by the nature of things, only one Elway, and he was gone, and the absence was felt. Through the 2000s, the franchise cycled through the normal rhythms of NFL life. Good seasons and disappointing ones, draft picks that produced and draft picks that did not, coaching changes and ownership changes, and the constant necessary hope that defines the relationship between a city and its team. And then, in the autumn of 2011, something wholly unexpected occurred. All reasonable footballing analysts and produced in its own eccentric way one of the most purely entertaining stretches of the Denver football had seen since the Orange Crush. Tim Tebow. Tim Tebow was a quarterback of limited NFL technique and apparently unlimited personal conviction. He ran more than he threw. He threw an emotion that quarterback coaches found troubling. He won football games in a way that seemed to violate the logical relationship between statistical performance and outcome. 6 times in the 2011 season, he brought Denver back from a deficit in the 4th quarter to win. 6 times. The nation watched with a mixture of bewilderment and fascination. The season culminated in a first-round playoff victory against the Pittsburgh Steelers, a victory secured by an 80-yard touchdown pass in the first play of overtime, a throw of such startling precision and power that it seemed to momentarily exceed the established limits of Tim Tebow's quarterbacking capability. Denver lost the following week. The era of Tebow ended almost as abruptly as it had begun. In the spring of 2012, walked a man who could write one final extraordinary chapter in the long Denver Broncos story. Peyton Manning arrived in Denver, having been released by the Indianapolis Colts following a series of neck surgeries that had raised genuine questions about whether he would ever play football again. He chose Denver. Denver chose him. What followed was one of the most remarkable acts of athletic reinvention in the history of professional sport. Manning could no longer throw the ball with the velocity of his youth. What he could do with a mastery so complete that it borderlined on the artistic was think faster than everyone else on the field. Peyton Manning at 36 was not the quarterback he had been at 26. He was better. Better in the way that a conductor is better at 60 than at 30. Not through the physical apparatus, which had diminished, but through the accumulated understanding of the music. In 2012, his first season in Denver, he threw for 37 touchdowns, and the Broncos won the AFC West. In 2013, he set the NFL record for touchdown passes in a single season, 55, and the Broncos won 13 games and reached the Super Bowl against the Seattle Seahawks, who were, in that particular season, a defense of extraordinary ferocity. Denver lost 43-8. It was the most lopsided loss in Super Bowl history. Manning sat with it, as Elway had sat with his losses, as all great champions sit with their most humbling defeats, not with denial, not with deflection, but with the full and honest understanding of what had happened and why, and a determination that it will not happen again. The 2014 and 2015 seasons brought their own trials. Manning was injured for portions of both. Brock Osweiler, his backup, played well in stretches. The defense, anchored by the ferocious outside linebacker Von Miller, was the supreme pass rusher of his generation, remained one of the finest in the conference. And then came the 2015 season, and the manner of its conclusion. The Broncos' defense in 2015 was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Von Miller and DeMarcus Ware bookend the defensive line in a manner opposing quarterbacks found deeply discouraging. The secondary was physical and intelligent. The entire unit played with a cohesion and fury that recalled, in the romantic image of Denver's long memory, the Orange Crush of 1977. Manning by this stage was throwing the ball carefully, very carefully, managing games with the intelligence of a grandmaster working with 3 remaining pieces on the board. The offense was not spectacular. It did not need to be. The defense was winning football games. The playoffs. Carolina, Super Bowl 50. The Carolina Panthers were the overwhelming favorites. Cam Newton, their quarterback, was the NFL's most valuable player, a physical specimen of astonishing. Denver's defense had another idea. Von Miller, in Super Bowl 50, played perhaps the finest game of any defensive player has ever played on the sport's largest stage. He recorded 2.5 sacks. He forced 2 fumbles that led directly to touchdowns. He was, on that February evening in Santa Clara, a force of nature operating at its absolute maximum. Denver won 24-10. Peyton Manning, standing at midfield as the confetti fell, was handed the Lombardi Trophy for the second time in his career, this time in orange. He had done what so few have managed to do. He had come back from the surgeries, from the doubts, from the record-breaking season that ended in humiliation, from the injuries and the backup appearances and the questions about whether he still had it. And he had, in the most consequential game of the year. Shortly thereafter, he retired. Denver had, in the space of 18 years, been graced by 2 of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of professional football, each in orange. The probability of this was vanishingly small. The reality of it was extraordinary. A franchise's greatness is not measured in championships alone. This we should understand. It is measured in the relationship between a team and a community over time, in the accumulated Sundays and the collective memory, and the way in which the fortunes of the team are woven into the fabric of the city's life. By this measure, the Denver Broncos are among the great franchises in American professional sport. The years that followed the Super Bowl were years of rebuilding, as all years eventually are in the cynical nature of professional sports. The search for a franchise quarterback continued. Drew Lock, Teddy Bridgewater, Russell Wilson arrived in 2022 with enormous expectations and faced the particular difficulty of any established star attempting to perform in an entirely new system in an entirely new city. The football was imperfect. The football was at times painfully imperfect. And yet the people of Denver came to Empower Field at Mile High, the stadium bearing the latest of several names, but standing on the same ground where the Orange Crush once held, and where the drive was celebrated, and where back-to-back champions were welcomed home. And they cheered, not because the team was winning, but because everything the team represents. Because the orange and the altitude and the 65 years of Sundays that precede every single one that follows. History is not a straight line. History is not a spiral. It revisits the same questions again and again, at different altitudes, with different players and different stakes, but with the underlying themes intact. The themes of the Denver Broncos are those of perseverance, belief, the particular stubbornness of a city that sits on top of a world and refuses to come down to anyone's expectations. Von Miller, who defined a generation of Broncos football, departed for other fields, but the standard he set, the culture he embodied, the ferocity which he played, they linger in the walls of the facility, and in the memories of the fan base, and the understanding, shared by every player who puts on that orange uniform, of what came before them and what is expected of them. A new generation is preparing its answer. Let us conclude where we began, at the foot of the mountains in a city a mile above the sea. The Denver Broncos have been, across 6.5 decades, a mirror of their city's character. Ambitious, occasionally humbled, capable of great beauty and occasional disorder. Built on a foundation of genuine love between the team and the community that neither triumph nor failure has been able to diminish. They have given us the orange crush and the orange socks and the drive and the fumble, and the back-to-back championships, the grace of Elway's retirement and the resilience of Manning's return. They have given us 44 minutes of history. This history, which is to say they have given us the full measure of the sport at its finest. Actually, it is. Not merely competition, not merely statistics and standings and salary caps. Sport at its finest, it is a public expression of a community's soul. It is the arena in which we test, in a setting blessedly free of genuine mortal consequence, the virtues we most admire and the failures we most fear, courage and cowardice, tenacity and surrender, the willingness to try again after the worst has already happened. The Denver Broncos, in 65 years of professional football, have been a sustained exercise in trying again. They tried again after the 3 Super Bowl disasters of the late 1980s. They tried again after the 43-8 catastrophe in New Jersey. They will try again tomorrow and the day after that, because that is the nature of the franchise, and the nature of the city, and if we are honest with ourselves, the nature of American enterprise at its best. We set out for the summit. We do not always reach it on the first attempt. We do not always reach it on the fourth, but we go back. We lace up. We run onto the field. In the shadow of the Rockies, under that wide and the Denver Broncos will play again, next season and the season after that, and for as long as the city of Denver draws breath and believes, which is to say, forever.